The rain began to fall over Manhattan much later than expected. The first heavy drops drummed against the thick glass windows of the historic Harrison estate. The sound echoed through the high ceilings like a sequence of urgent knocks. But no one moved to open the door. Inside the vast library on the third floor, the air carried the scent of old beeswax, faded leather bindings, and a silence that had accumulated over centuries. The fire in the marble fireplace crackled softly. Its amber glow danced across the rows of floor-to-ceiling oak bookshelves. The small flames flickered gently, trying to push back the chill creeping through the brass window frames. Julian Harrison stood with his back against the edge of a massive mahogany desk. One hand was casually tucked into the pocket of his bespoke trousers. The other hand slowly swirled a crystal tumbler filled with an expensive single malt scotch. At 35, Julian possessed the striking appearance of a man who had never faced a refusal in his entire life. His dark hair was brushed back perfectly. His gray eyes were cold and sharp. He wore a charcoal suit tailored within an inch of absolute arrogance. He stared down at the pile of legal documents spread flat across the desk. 3 elderly corporate attorneys sat in front of him, their faces frozen in professional silence. The glass of their spectacles caught the warm, dim light of the ancient green-shaded desk lamp. Opposite them, in the dimmest corner of the room where the firelight could barely reach, sat a young woman. She sat on a simple wooden chair, her slender hands resting flat on her lap. Eleanor Vance. She was 26 years old, wearing a faded gray woolen sweater and a simple long skirt. Her light brown hair was pinned neatly back in a low knot, exposing a pale, delicate face with unreadable blue-gray eyes. For the past 3 months, her role at the estate had been that of an archivist, a quiet cleaner of history. She had been hired for a minimum fee to sort, catalog, and digitalize thousands of old family books that the modern world had forgotten. Julian looked at her. His gaze drifted across the frayed sleeves of Eleanor's sweater with an open contempt he didn't care to hide. To him, she was just a temporary line on the estate's expense ledger, a ghost moving through the dust of his ancestors. "The time is running out," Julian said. His voice was low, smooth, and carried the heavy weight of an ultimatum. "Sign the papers, Eleanor. Your signature is the last formality required to liquidate the Harrison Historical Collection. The auction houses in London are waiting." Eleanor did not look up immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on the small, worn leather journal in her hands. It was a book she had found buried at the bottom of a locked iron chest behind the lower shelves earlier that afternoon. A book that had not been opened in nearly a century. "This collection belongs to the Foundation," Eleanor said softly. Her voice was calm, maddeningly even. It was the voice of someone who spent her life listening to the quiet rustle of paper rather than the loud demands of boardroom meetings. "Your grandfather explicitly stated in his public letters that these archives must remain in New York for the public benefit. They are a historical trust, Julian." Julian let out a short, humorless laugh. He took a slow sip of his scotch, the ice cubes clinking softly against the crystal glass. The sound was sharp in the silent room. "My grandfather has been dead for 2 months," Julian replied, stepping closer to the desk. The amber light caught the sharp lines of his jaw. "And public benefit does not pay off the debt structure of Harrison Global Holdings. Times change, Eleanor. Romantic notions of heritage do not survive high interest rates. You are being paid to organize the catalog, not to protect it." The lead attorney, a man named Richard, cleared his throat nervously. He slid a heavy gold fountain pen across the leather blotter toward Eleanor. "Miss Vance," Richard said, his voice clipped and professional. "Mr. Harrison is correct from a strictly legal standpoint. As the sole surviving heir, Julian Harrison has the authority to restructure the estate's tangible assets. Your cooperation will expedite the severance package we discussed." Eleanor finally raised her eyes. Her blue-gray gaze met Julian's cold stare without a single flinch. There was no anger in her face, no fear. Only a deep, unshakable clarity that seemed to trouble the edges of Julian's confidence. "A tangible asset," Eleanor repeated quietly. You see ancient texts and handwritten journals as mere collateral. That is exactly what they are, Julian said, leaning his hands on the desk, pressing his face closer to hers. To the rest of the world, they are dust. To the banks, they are $40 million. Sign the waiver, Eleanor. Your contract ends tonight. Don't make me have security escort you out into the rain. Eleanor looked down at the old journal again. The leather was dry and crumbling at the edges. The gold embossing on the spine had faded into a dull, ghost-like shadow. But on page 72, beneath a layer of old protective tissue paper, she had found something else. Something the family's expensive lawyers had completely missed. Because they had looked at the books as boxes to be weighed, not texts to be read. I will not sign it, Eleanor said softly. The room grew instantly colder. Richard, the attorney, froze. The two other lawyers looked at each other with sudden anxiety. Outside, the thunder rolled over the Hudson River, a low, ominous vibration that shook the old glass panes of the library. Julian's expression darkened. The smooth, polite mask of the billionaire began to slip, revealing the dangerous edge beneath. He set his glass down on the mahogany table with a loud, deliberate thud. I think you misinterpret your position here, Eleanor, Julian said. His voice dropped an octave, turning into a quiet threat. You are a clerk. You earn an hourly wage to dust off my family's old vanity projects. You do not have a say in this room. You do not have power. Eleanor did not answer with anger. Instead, she stood up slowly. Her posture was flawless, straight and dignified, despite her worn clothes. She picked up the small leather journal and stepped into the warm amber light of the desk lamp. I may not have power, Julian, Eleanor said quietly, but the numbers do. And your grandfather understood power much better than you do. She placed the journal directly over the modern legal contract Julian had been pushing toward her. She turned the book around, sliding it half an inch so the light from the green lamp illuminated the handwritten text on page 72. Look at the ink, Eleanor said, pointing a slender finger toward the bottom of the page. The cursive script was tight, elegant, and written in a dark blue ink that had turned almost black over 90 years. Julian didn't move at first. His pride resisted the instruction. But Richard, the old attorney, instinctively leaned forward. His eyes narrowed behind his glasses as he caught sight of the specific phrasing. What is this? Richard muttered, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the journal. It is the original ledger of the 1934 Harrison Trust Agreement, Eleanor explained. Her voice was steady, filling the large library with a terrifying precision. The public documents you reviewed in the corporate archives were only the secondary amendments, the ones filed after the reorganization. But the foundational charter is right here. Julian folded his arms, his gray eyes narrowing into slits. This is a 90-year-old diary, Eleanor. It has no legal standing in a modern corporate restructuring. Look at the third paragraph, Julian, Eleanor said, her voice remaining calm. Force them all to lean in closer. Look at the handwritten correction by your great-grandfather, Arthur Harrison. Richard read the words aloud, his voice dropping into a tense whisper. The historical library, including all manuscripts, ledgers, and correspondences, shall be held in perpetuity by the Autonomous Archivist Trust. No sale, liquidation, or transfer of these specific assets can be executed without the unanimous consent of the appointed custodian. In the event of an attempted forced liquidation, all corporate shares of Harrison Global Holdings tied to the estate's land assets shall immediately revert to the Municipal Educational Board. The silence that followed was absolute. The crackle of the fireplace suddenly sounded incredibly loud. The rain continued to lash against the windows, but inside the library, the air had turned into a vacuum. Richard looked up from the page. His face had lost all of its professional color. He looked at Julian, then back at the book, his fingers tightening around the edge of the mahogany desk. Julian, Richard whispered, his voice shaking. If this is the original charter, if this clause was never repealed, it's an old note. Julian snapped, his composure finally breaking. He snatched the journal from the table, his gray eyes scanning the handwriting with a sudden, desperate speed. My great-grandfather died before the modern corporation was even formed. This means nothing. It means everything, Eleanor said quietly, stepping back into the shadows of the room. The modern corporation was built on the back of the 1934 land assets. The land beneath your corporate headquarters in Midtown is still legally tied to this estate charter. If you liquidate these books, you trigger the grandfather clause. You don't just lose the $40 million from the auction, Julian. You lose the land beneath your towers. Julian's jaw tightened. His right thumb began to press hard against the edge of the leather cover, his index finger turning white. It was the only tell, the only sign that the billionaire was recalculating his entire position in a matter of seconds. He looked at Eleanor. For the first time all evening, there was no mockery left in his eyes. There was only calculation, only the cold, immediate realization that the quietest person in the room knew exactly where the vulnerability was hidden. "Who are you?" Julian asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You are not just a clerk from the university listing titles." Eleanor met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I am the daughter of Thomas Vance," she said softly. Richard gasped. The two other lawyers looked as though they wanted to disappear into the woodwork of the room. "Thomas Vance," Julian repeated, memory matching to present reality. "The forensic auditor who tried to stop my father's expansion 20 years ago. The one who disappeared from the financial sector after his reputation was ruined." "My father didn't lose his reputation," Eleanor said, her voice remaining quiet but turning ice-cold. "He lost his health trying to protect the truth. He told me before he died that the Harrisons always hid their true liabilities where people only look when they trust you. He knew this ledger existed. He just didn't live long enough to find it." Julian stood frozen. The leather folder containing the multi-million-dollar liquidation contract suddenly looked like a piece of waste paper on his desk. Outside, the storm grew fiercer. The thunder rolled again, closer this time, shaking the foundations of the old house. But inside the library, the true power had shifted completely. The billionaire in the bespoke suit was no longer commanding the room. He was standing in the presence of a clerk who held the string that could unravel his entire empire. Julian Caldwell Harrison did not move for a long time. His gray eyes remained fixed on Eleanor Vance, trying to find a crack in her composure, a hint of hesitation, a sign that she was bluffing, but there was none. Eleanor stood with her hands folded gently in front of her gray sweater, the picture of absolute stillness. "Richard," Julian said, his voice dangerously quiet, not looking away from Eleanor. "Tell me she is wrong. Tell me this clause was superseded by the 1982 corporate restructure." Richard the attorney was already flipping through a thick leather-bound reference volume his assistant had brought. His fingers were trembling so much that the pages made a loud, frantic rustling sound against the quiet of the room. He scanned the lines, his eyes moving rapidly behind his thick lenses. I am looking, Julian," Richard stammered, a thin sheen of sweat visible on his forehead under the green lamp. "The 1982 restructure absorbed the land assets, yes, but it did so under the umbrella of the original estate. If the original estate charter contains an unrepealed in perpetuity restriction—" "Speak English, Richard," Julian commanded. "If it's real," Richard whispered, looking up with a pale face, "then the restriction is still active." The corporate lawyers who drafted the 1982 agreement never looked at the handwritten ledgers. They assumed the public registry was complete. "They missed it, Julian. We all missed it." Julian let out a slow, controlled breath through his nose. He turned the journal over in his hands, looking at the faded gold letters on the spine. The arrogance that had filled his posture all evening seemed to harden into something colder, something defensive. He stepped around the mahogany desk, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. He stopped just 3 feet away from Eleanor. He was much taller than her, his shadow broad and intimidating under the amber light of the room. But Eleanor did not take a step back. She did not tilt her head up in defiance. She simply kept her eyes on him, waiting. "You think you've won, don't you?" Julian asked softly. "You think this brings back your father's career? You think you can use my family's history to exact some kind of poetic justice?" "This isn't about justice, Julian," Eleanor replied. Her voice was so quiet that Julian had to lean in slightly to hear her over the sound of the rain. "Justice is too expensive for people like my father. This is simply about the numbers. The numbers don't care about your debts, and they don't care about my past. They just demand to be accurate." Julian studied her face. Up close, he could see the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes. He knew her story now. He knew she had been supporting her ailing mother, working 3 different low-paying archival jobs across the city, living in a cramped apartment in Queens. She had every reason to hate him, every reason to destroy his afternoon. And yet, there was no malice in her demeanor, no triumph. It was the lack of emotion that unsettled him the most. A person with anger could be bought or manipulated. A person with pure discipline was a force of nature. "What do you want, Eleanor?" Julian asked. His voice had lost its edge of cruelty. It was the tone he used when a negotiation had turned serious, when the charm had failed and the real math had begun. "Name your price. The severance package can be expanded. 500,000. $1 million. We can create a consulting role for you at the firm. You never have to dust another old book again." Eleanor looked down at his expensive leather shoes, then back up to his sharp, handsome face. "You still think everything is a transaction, Julian," she said softly. "You think you can buy the silence of the custodian. But that is the problem with your generation of Harrisons. You think the table always belongs to the person who pays for the room." Julian's mouth tightened. "I am offering you a way out of a difficult life, Eleanor. Don't let pride make a foolish decision for you. And I am offering you a way to save your company from ruin," Eleanor countered. "If you sign the modern contract on that desk, Richard and his team will file the paperwork tomorrow morning. The moment the filing hits the state database, the municipal board will be notified of the asset transfer. The trigger is automated, Julian. Your legal team wouldn't even have time to file an injunction before the shares revert." Richard looked at Julian and nodded slowly, confirming her words with a look of pure dread. Julian turned back to the desk. He looked at the white pages of the contract, then at the small, dark leather journal. For 35 years, he had operated under the assumption that speed and power were the only rules of survival. If you were fast enough, you could outrun the consequences of a bad debt structure. If you were powerful enough, you could force the room to agree with your version of the truth. But tonight, the room had stopped moving. The rain outside seemed to have slowed into a steady, rhythmic pattern, a continuous gray wall enclosing the library. He walked back to the desk and picked up the gold fountain pen. For a second, Richard thought Julian was going to sign the contract anyway, out of sheer stubbornness. But Julian didn't slide the paper toward himself. Instead, he unscrewed the cap of the pen, held it over the contract, and drew a thick, black line through the signature page. The 2 other lawyers let out a simultaneous breath, their shoulders dropping in relief. "The liquidation is cancelled," Julian said clearly. His voice was steady, but it sounded different now. The performance was gone. The corporate mask had been laid aside, leaving only the raw reality of a man who had just paid for his lesson with his ego. Richard stood up, gathering his files with rapid, nervous movements. We will draft a formal withdrawal for the London auction houses immediately. Julian, we'll need to review the entire 1934 charter line by line before the morning." "Do that," Julian said, not looking at him. "Take the team and use the conference room downstairs. Leave the ledgers here." Richard didn't wait for a second invitation. Within 2 minutes, the 3 lawyers had gathered their briefcases and scurried out of the room, closing the heavy oak doors behind them with a soft, muted click. The library became immensely quiet. Only the sound of the fire and the rain remained. The amber light hatted across the empty chairs, the discarded papers, and the 2 people left standing in the center of the room. Julian looked down at the handwritten notation by his great-grandfather. He tracing the blue-black ink with his thumb. He ignored the numbers. Julian murmured, almost to himself. My father. He knew the expansion was risky, but he thought he could hide the exposure in the subsidiary notes. He thought no one would read the foundational text. They didn't, Eleanor said, walking over to the desk. Until tonight. Julian looked up at her. He pulled out the large leather chair behind the desk. The chair that had belonged to 3 generations of Harrison CEOs. Sit down, Eleanor, he said quietly. Eleanor looked at the chair, then at him. I have work to finish in the archives, Mr. Harrison. My contract ends at midnight. Please, Julian said. It wasn't a command. The old habit of authority was gone, replaced by a difficult, unfamiliar politeness. It clearly cost him an effort to use that word, but he used it anyway. Eleanor studied him for a beat, measuring the change in his eyes. Then, she walked around the desk and sat down in the heavy leather chair. The symmetry was perfect. The clerk in the faded sweater was now sitting at the head of the empire, while the billionaire stood under the dim amber light, looking down at the evidence of his family's vulnerability. Tell me about the rest of the ledger, Julian said, leaning his hip against the edge of the desk, his gray eyes fixed on her face. What else did my great-grandfather hide in these pages? Eleanor turned the book to page 75. Her gay gook fingers moved with a reverent care that Julian had never seen anyone apply to a piece of paper. He didn't hide anything to deceive people, Julian, Eleanor said softly, her voice guiding him into the past. He wrote these entries during the Great Depression. The family firm was close to collapse, just like yours is now. But instead of sacrificing the people who built the company, he chose to sacrifice the near-term premium. He took the debt onto his own personal estate to keep the historical trust intact. He believed that if a company has to destroy its own history to survive, it was never strong enough to stand in the light. Julian looked away, his gaze drifting toward the high windows. The rain was sliding down the glass in long, silver ribbons, blurring the distant lights of the Manhattan skyline. For his entire life, he had been taught that his ancestors were gods of finance who had never hesitated, never shown weakness. But the handwriting in front of him told a different story, a human story, one built on compromise, sacrifice, and a deep sense of responsibility to the future. My father told me that your father was a dangerous man, Julian said quietly, his eyes still on the window. He said Thomas Vance was trying to destroy the family name because of jealousy. Your father needed a convenient story, Eleanor replied. Her voice held no bitterness, only that calm, unyielding precision. It is always easier to call the auditor a liar than to admit the ledger is broken. My father loved the math, Julian. He didn't care about the Harrison name. He just couldn't stand to see a perfect system ruined by an unrecorded liability. Silence returned to the library. It was not the tense, suffocating silence from before, but something larger, something honest. A quiet space where the truth could finally settle after 20 years of being hidden in the margins. Downstairs, the distant chime of the grandfather clock in the main hall struck 11. 1 hour left before Eleanor's contract expired. Julian reached into the inner pocket of his charcoal jacket. He withdrew a small, heavy card case made of brushed silver. He extracted a single card, thick and white with embossed navy lettering, and placed it gently on the leather blotter beside Eleanor's hand. Come work for the firm, Eleanor, Julian said. His voice was low, devoid of any corporate performance. I am starting the restructuring of Harrison Global Holdings tomorrow morning. I don't need lawyers who tell me what I want to hear. I need someone who reads the footnotes. Eleanor looked down at the white rectangle on the desk. The name Julian C. Harrison was engraved in clean, elegant lines. That is a very fast offer, Mr. Harrison, she said softly. Fast was me threatening to have you removed from my house because you were wearing an old sweater, Julian replied, a faint, humorless smile touching his lips before vanishing. Fast was me assuming that wealth gave me the right to ignore the quietest person in the room. I am not offering you a rescue, Eleanor. I know you don't need one. Then what are you offering? She asked, her blue-gray eyes meeting his. Accountability, Julian said clearly. Mine. And a seat at a table that should have listened to your father 20 years ago. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. The storm outside seemed to be losing its fury, the heavy thunder moving away toward Long Island, leaving only the steady, soothing sound of a midnight rain. She stood up from the leather executive chair. She didn't touch the silver card immediately. Instead, she took her linen cloth from her pocket and carefully wiped the dust from the surface of the mahogany desk, returning the workspace to its proper, orderly state. She closed the ancient leather journal with a soft, solid click. If I ever sit at your table, Mr. Harrison, Eleanor said, her voice quiet enough to make him listen with absolute attention, it will not be because you noticed my existence tonight. She picked up the embossed card at last, her slender fingers slipping it into the deep pocket of her long skirt. It will be because you have finally learned to notice the truth, she finished softly. Julian looked up at her, and something rare moved through his sharp features. It wasn't defeat. It wasn't simple admiration. It was the quiet, profound respect that arrives only after pride has been forced to make room for something greater than itself. Eleanor turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors. Her steps were calm and measured. Her posture remained straight as she moved through the long shadows of the library. Her reflection passed through the warm amber light and the rain-streaked glass of the tall windows, a quiet figure moving with an unshakable dignity. She had entered the room 3 months ago as a nameless clerk, an expense line to be minimized. She left it tonight as the standard he had failed to meet. Long after the heavy doors closed behind her, Julian Harrison remained standing beneath the emerald lamp, staring at the empty leather chair across from him. He looked at the ancient journal, finally understanding that the quietest people in the world were never the least powerful. They were simply the ones who didn't need to make noise to be believed. The rain continued to fall over Manhattan, a soft, continuous ambient sound that filled the empty spaces of the great house, washing away the dust of old lies, leaving only the clean, cold reality of the morning to come. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a bed of glowing red embers, casting long, still shadows across the empty library. The silence here was different now. It had the weight of an aftermath. A clean slate. Julian Harrison did not leave the room. He sat in the chair Eleanor had just vacated, his fingers resting on the dry leather of the 1934 journal. He didn't open it again. He didn't need to. The lines on page 72 were already etched into his memory, a permanent correction to the narrative he had lived by for 35 years. Outside, the city was asleep beneath a gray shroud of October rain. The corporate towers of Midtown, usually blazing with white light and ambition, looked distant and fragile through the wet glass. They were structures built on land, and land was built on contracts, and contracts, as he had learned tonight, were ultimately built on the integrity of the people who signed them. He thought of his father, a man who had died in a hospital room surrounded by expensive equipment and cheap loyalties. A man who had spent his final years looking over his shoulder, waiting for the forensic auditors to find the thread that Eleanor Vance had pulled with a single sentence. His father had won every boardroom battle he ever fought, yet he had died terrified of a book he had hidden in his own library. What a miserable way to hold power, Julian thought. He picked up the gold fountain pen again. The ink was dark, almost black in the low light. On a clean sheet of corporate stationery, he began to write the outline for the restructuring plan. He didn't start with the debt financing or the asset allocation. He started with the footnotes. He listed every liability his father had deferred, every shell company layer that had been designed to keep the regulators asleep. He laid it all out in simple, unembellished sentences. He was still writing when the door opened softly at midnight. Vincent, the old house butler, stepped into the room with a silver tray. He carried a fresh pot of black coffee and a clean porcelain cup. His movements were slow, practiced, the result of 40 years of service to a family that rarely looked at his face. Mr. Harrison, Vincent said, his voice a low, respectful murmur. The attorneys have left the conference room. Richard asked me to tell you that they have confirmed the validity of the municipal reversion clause. They are waiting for your instructions at the office tomorrow morning. Julian didn't look up from his writing. Leave the coffee, Vincent, and tell Richard to have the full disclosure language ready by 8 a.m. No selective edits. Vincent paused. His old hands remained steady on the tray, but his eyes drifted to the crossed-out contract on the desk, then to the ancient journal. He had known Julian since he was a boy. He had seen the arrogance grow like armor around the young heir, turning him into a carbon copy of the men who had broken the city before him. But tonight the armor looked thin. The posture was still flawless, but the shoulders were carrying a different kind of weight. "Is there anything else, sir?" Vincent asked. Julian stopped writing. He set the pen down and looked at the old butler. Really looked at him for perhaps the first time in 10 years. He saw the white hair at Vincent's temples, the deep lines around his mouth, the faded uniform that had been mended at the seam with a thread that didn't quite match. "Where is Miss Vance?" Julian asked. "She has left, sir," Vincent replied softly. "She refused the car we prepared for her. She said she preferred to walk to the subway station." "It is still raining quite heavily," Julian added, his voice carrying a rare touch of human concern. Julian nodded once, his jaw tightening. "Did she leave an address for her final check?" "She did," Vincent said, sliding a small slip of paper from his pocket and placing it on the tray beside the coffee pot. "But she told me to tell you that the final week of her contract was already covered by the Historical Trust's initial deposit. She said the Harrisons don't owe her anything." Julian looked at the slip of paper. The handwriting was identical to the precision he had seen on the desk blotter. Neat, clear, and perfectly aligned. "No," Julian whispered, his voice almost lost in the sound of the rain against the glass. "We owe her everything." Vincent didn't ask for an explanation. He set the porcelain cup down with a soft click, picked up his empty tray, and bowed slightly. "Good night, Mr. Harrison." "Good night, Vincent," Julian said. The door closed, and Julian was alone again with the numbers. He poured the coffee into the bone china cup. The steam rose in soft, white ribbons, dissolving into the dark air of the library. He picked up his pen and returned to the pages. The rain outside continued its long, rhythmic lullaby, a gray wall of water separating the historic estate from the frantic, noisy city beyond. In the quiet of the third-floor library, the billionaire who had spent his life commanding rooms settled in for a long night of learning how to read the truth. He didn't hurry. He didn't perform. He simply turned the next page, his gray eyes steady under the green lamp, listening to the small, regular click of the pen against the paper, a quiet sound that was louder than any empire he had ever built. The rain fell, the embers died, and in the darkness of Manhattan, a broken ledger was finally being made whole.